You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tom, and today we are going to explore an area of cinema that I feel very passionately about, the world of disturbing films. We are going to discuss why we are drawn to films that we know are intended to disturb the viewer, and consider whether the calibre of the filmmaking can have an impact on how disturbing a film can be. We are also going to discuss the films that have disturbed us the most and why they have had such a lasting impact on us. I'm joined today with my brilliant co-hosts, Adam, Clem and Sol, and it would be great to hear each of your stances on disturbing films so the listeners can understand our individual perspectives on the subject. But first of all, if you'd like to introduce yourself and just explain if you purposefully seek out disturbing films, and if so, what is it that draws you to them?
Hi, this is Adam from New York City. I'm known as Blocko on the ICM forum. I wouldn't call myself someone who really likes disturbing movies, actually, but I'm very intrigued by the concept.
Hey, this is Clem from France. I'm really happy to be back. Disturbing films are something I watch from time to time, even though it's not my favorite type of films.
Hi, this is Sol from Australia. I do watch quite a few disturbing films as an avid horror fan, and I think I like watching disturbing films mainly in order to feel something, because there's nothing worse than watching a movie and feeling absolutely nothing afterwards.
I think that's a great point, Sol, about watching a film purposefully to make you feel something. I personally love it when films are powerful enough to stir up an emotional reaction in me, whether it's, happiness, sadness, disgust, or even to be disturbed. I think that films that are powerful enough to elicit an emotional response in the viewer are usually far more enjoyable than ones that aren't. And even though being disturbed isn't necessarily an emotional response that people would associate with having a good time, I think when watching a film, it is good to have that kind of notion of being challenged with what you're watching. So we thought it'd be interesting to see if there's a clear difference between films that disturb us as opposed to those which are scary or upsetting or sad. So I'd like to hear from everyone and see what your thoughts are on this idea.
This is the topic that most intrigues me on this issue, the question of what is disturbing. And as I've written to all of you before, if we think of knowledge and words as something that we develop the meaning of within ourselves, then disturbing could mean something entirely different to different people. Disturbing might be something that's upsetting, or something that is sad, or something that is frightening. It might be something that inspires moral outrage, or it might be related to something that involves some sort of awful visual spectacle, or it might be something that inspires a sense of revulsion. I thought a lot about it over the past week, and I think for me personally, I think of disturbing, and I think of the movies that I think of disturbing, what stands out to me is that there tend to be movies that betray my expectations of what I might see, what I'm used to seeing on screen, as well as movies that betray my expectations of the order of the world or the assumptions we can make about them.
So for you, Adam, a film being disturbing is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not necessarily a bad feeling. It's just that the film challenge your perceptions and challenge your expectation toward the film, correct?
Yes, I would agree with that. And I'm sympathetic to what Saul and Tom said earlier about how a disturbing movie can be a good thing if we find it emotionally compelling. I agree completely that movies that elicit an emotional reaction are often movies that I enjoy more, even if those emotional reactions are not necessarily positive feelings.
All right. I would agree with all of you that sometimes it's good to have your expectation and to challenge your view on the world and what you would expect when watching a film. I believe that films in general have the power to generate a lot of different emotions. Sometimes even within the same movie, you can feel a lot of different things, which is why I love also watching films, to feel this type of emotions that could change from time to time as the film progresses. I also thought a lot about what disturbing really means. I think it's interesting that it is hard to define term, even though it seems that it's a term that embodies a lot of different films. So it's interesting to see that it's hard to define, but at the same time, there are quite a few films I would think of as disturbing, even though I couldn't really be able to define what the word really means to me.
I agree with Clem. The term disturbing is very hard to define. And I also agree with what Adam said, that different people have different perceptions of what disturbing is. And one of the things which Adam mentioned was moral outrage. A lot of people I've met in real life who talk about disturbing films, they talk about films that sort of challenge their morals on, subjects that are comfortable to watch. What I look at with a disturbing film, the difference between disturbing and scary for me is probably how realistic the film is trying to be. If I think of something like The Human Centipede, that's not really trying to be a realistic film about a guy going out and creating a centipede out of human beings. It's not trying to be real. It's trying to be a horror film. It's trying to be fiction. However, if I get something like Martyrs, which is a film that I hope to discuss a little bit later, that's actually trying to be realistic and say some very real things about what human beings are capable of doing to each other. And I think that disturbs me more because it's more trying to be real rather than just presenting a clear narrative story.
I think that you're all right with the very notion that disturbing film is subjective. It does depend a lot on the viewer. And often the emotions of being sad and upset can go hand in hand with a disturbing film. And it can be difficult to segregate these emotions from one another. I think for me, though, when I consider a film that is disturbing, it's usually those films that have a longer lasting impact and stay with me, whether that be images that are kind of burned into my mind just through the horror of what I've seen, or some form of psychological trauma that kind of shakes me to the core and means that I'll never forget the experience. And I really like how Adam brought up the notion of films that betray our expectations, because often when we think of disturbing films, we go straight towards the horror genre. But sometimes the most disturbing element of a film can come in a film that isn't associated with the horror genre. And we'll just have one or two striking moments that seemingly come out of nowhere that are completely jarring and take you by surprise because it's not something that you would have expected to see in that film. And that can be equally as disturbing as the moments that we witness in horror films.
I think disturbing, even though it's hard to describe, is referring to negative things, negative images, negative ideas or opinion. So I think it's normal that when people think of disturbing film, they would mostly think of violent films or negative films, let's say. So it would be more films like horror films, thriller type of films. Personally, I realized that I will be more disturbed by a film which has psychological violence in it rather than physical. Films like home invasion type of films, I usually find them very disturbing, even though they're not completely horror films and have mostly thriller elements. I think that these films are the films I have the most trouble watching, that are the hardest for me to watch, even though they don't really feature any physical violence, but just the idea of home invasion in general is something that disturbs me in real life, I think, which is why it also really disturbs me when I'm watching it on the screen.
I'm really sympathetic to what Clem is saying about sometimes the idea is much more disturbing than what we see. This also relates to what Tom said about how it's not always horror movies that we find most disturbing. I mentioned before that sometimes a certain moral outrage can be very disturbing. Two of the movies that I thought of when I listed out the movies that are most disturbing to me, just off the top of my head, not horror movies at all. I thought about Whiplash, which I've actually written about a bit on the ICM forum recently. And I've thought about the 2019 movie, The Report, which was a historical film about the torture program run by the CIA in the United States and the investigation into that program. Though there are a few scenes of torture, they don't really measure up to anything you could see in your average torture porn movie.
That's very interesting, Adam. I'd love to know more about what your thoughts are on Whiplash and why it is disturbing, because I think it's a great, very suspenseful edge of your seat film. For me, it didn't disturb me as such, but I'd love to see your perspective on it. That would be interesting.
Whiplash is a movie that I've come to understand a lot of people really love, and I don't want to tell them that they're wrong. It's a movie I really, really dislike, and there are two reasons for that. One is that I feel it really portrays the meaning and the history of jazz, but we can put that aside for a moment and focus more on what I think is the moral or theme of the story. There's no real way to discuss that without really spoiling the entire movie, which I'm prepared to do, but I thought I'd give people a fair warning that they might want to skip over the next minute. When I saw this movie, I thought the theme of the movie was abuse of power and abusive relationships. And that's a theme I normally expect that to be treated negatively. The climactic scene of Whiplash reversed that expectation for me. And to me, the message of the movie was that this abusive figure in the movie is actually doing our protagonist a service, and that our protagonist benefits from the abuse. I thought that was horrifying and inspired a sense of revulsion in me. That's partly because I had a mentor in grad school who was abusive as well. Not nearly to the extent of the character in Whiplash, but it certainly was an abusive relationship. And I find that there's nothing at all redeeming about it. That's why I truly walked away from that movie horrified and revolted and very disturbed.
That's a fascinating point, Adam, and I think it links in very nicely with what we've said already about the nature of disturbing films being subjective, because you mentioned there that the events that are portrayed in Whiplash are relatable to yourself. So disturbing films have this ability to prey on the fears of people who can relate or find some comparison in the films to their own lives, and perhaps, helps to explain why it's subjective, and it depends on our own personal experiences and our own fears that we have as a viewer.
Might just mention that I actually had a similar reaction to Adam. I didn't dislike the film, but it did knock it down a bit in my esteem because I wasn't quite sure at the end of it what to make of the J.K. Simmons character, what his motives really were throughout, and whether it was just something random tapped on at the end. There was definitely a strange ending to a film, which it seemed to be a lot about abuse and a lot about psychological torture. Might also just mention, because Clem brought it up, home invasion films is also something that I find really scary and something that is a bit disturbing for me to watch. Things like Darren Aronofsky's Mother were a bit disturbing for me to watch, about people coming in and sort of taking over your house and ruining everything.
Yeah, I still haven't seen Mother for this reason, because I know it won't be a good experience for me to watch it. So I have the film, but I haven't really found the time and the motivation yet to watch it.
Mother is a great film. It's not an easy film to watch, but the whole living, breathing nightmare of it was just amazing how well it managed to capture it on screen. And I felt, wow, these are all emotions that I felt at different points in my life. It's not a film that I could watch again easily, but it was definitely very powerful for me in terms of, when we're talking about disturbing films, being able to make you feel something.
Mother is an excellent film. I found it quite disturbing, and I think that links in quite nicely to our next point about whether the calibre of a film has an impact on how disturbing it is, because Mother is made by Darren Aronofsky, and he's an excellent filmmaker. The visual effects in the film, the cinematography were all brilliant, and they obviously have an impact on the most disturbing moments that we see. So it's interesting to compare kind of impact of disturbing films when you consider sleazy exploitation films from like the late 70s. You've got stuff like I Spit on Your Grave and Last House on the Left, which are kind of like raw, visceral, grimy films, unrelenting and kind of grainy in how they are presented as well. And then if you compare them to art house films, you look at the disturbing films of Von Trier, like Antichrist and The House That Jack Built. And also you've got the films of Gaspar Noé, so Irreversible and I Stand Alone. And there's a clear contrast between those. And I'd be curious to hear if anyone has a view on which of those two angles they would find more disturbing.
I don't really find that the budget for the film or the class of a film really disturbs me that much. It's really the themes, what's going on, and how it's presented, which makes a film disturbing for me. It's interesting that you bring up Von Trier, because a film of his I saw recently in the cinemas was House That Jack Built. That's actually the film that's had the second most walkouts of any film that I've seen in my life. Saw it in a very small cinema. There would have only been maybe 20 or 25 seats in there. and 5 people walk out at 3 different key points in the film, and all those key points are ingrained in my mind because of that. And none of it was really that disturbing to me. Obviously, there's some quite shocking things in there, but The House That Jack Built is a black comedy, and I was laughing out loud at certain points, especially to do with how obsessive compulsive he is, because I'm a little bit OCD myself. I could relate to it, and he kept going back into the house, checking for blood stains and so on. So I found it to be very funny. Yes, there's some disturbing stuff in there, but it's presented as a comedy. Didn't find it that disturbing, but obviously people had come to the film, they hadn't read anything about it, they had no idea who Von Trier is. They probably saw Matt Dillon's name and go, oh, I liked him in Crash, or I liked him in those Gus Van Sant films. They've sat down and watched it not knowing what to expect. I think if you knew what to expect, I can't imagine that The House That Jack Built would be such a disturbing film.
It's funny that you mentioned the walkouts and the house that Jack built, because I had a similar experience when I went to see Antichrist. For me, I think there is perhaps a few more disturbing moments in Antichrist than the house that Jack built, and they're perhaps more well known because there are the scenes of genital mutilation that are very disturbing. And they prompted a number of walkouts in the Arto cinema where I viewed it. There was a few old couples in there. Perhaps they weren't sure of what they were going to see, but when those scenes came on, it was clear that they weren't going to stay for the remainder of the film.
In order to avoid keeping people in suspense, because I said The House That Jack Built had the second most walkouts, the film that's actually had the most walkouts that I've gone and seen is actually Adam McKay's Vice, a film about Dick Cheney. There's a bit of a story to that. There was actually a fire scare at the cinema, and we had to evacuate the cinema towards the end. And I was standing around with a group of other people who had gone and seen the film, and decided, oh, this is pretty lousy. It's not a really great film. We're just going to go home. We're actually not going to stick around and wait for them to put out the fire, wait for them to check that it was just a hoax. Anyway, it was just a hoax, and I went back in, as well as the other people who I was seeing Vice with. I think at that point we might have had 10 people back in the cinema when they started re-showing the movie, being at least 30, maybe 40 people. So, and not so much because it's disturbing, but that one did have the most walkouts, and there's an interesting story to go along with it. Something else I might mention about Vice, just because it's interesting, even though it's not quite related to disturbing theme. The reason we knew there was a fire is that there was this blaring horn sound. But of course, with Vice, Adam McKay being himself and putting all these random, strange and weird things in, I thought, oh, this is just part of the film. This is just Adam McKay being annoying again. He'd already restarted and had the end credits in there and carried on all the other tricks. So we're all looking at each other in this theatre going, is this part of the film, or is this alarm actually an alarm? It's actually kind of interesting, because if you think about a film like Demons, the Italian horror film from the 1980s, that's about cinema patrons, and there's all these demons coming out of the theatre, and they actually think it's part of the film, and I guess it can be a bit disturbing in itself if you become so immersed in the movie. You don't realise when there's actually an emergency happening within the cinema itself. If you think about the beginning of Wes Craven's Scream 2, where the first murder is happening in the cinema in a showing of the movie Stab, this woman gets up, she's stabbed in front of everybody, and nobody reacts because they all think it's just a prankster. They all think it's actually part of the film experience.
Definitely understand that an actual emergency in the cinema is definitely the most disturbing thing. I really like, Saul, how you sort of tied it to movies where what we see on screen might implicitly threaten where we are at that moment. Those were two great examples that you gave, Demons and Screen 2. I was just thinking about how if you're ever on an airplane, you see a movie on the airplane that comes from the entertainment system, they will always edit out anything in the movie related to plane crashes. I think that's an example of how even when we're willing to see disturbing things on screen, people are often definitely not willing to see disturbing things that feel threatening to them in that moment.
That's a great point to raise, Adam, because there are actually certain companies that put on specific screenings in certain locations to enhance the experience of the film. I know that there have been screenings of Jaws, for instance, in swimming pools or outside on the water where people will be actually in the water while they're watching Jaws. And there's also been things over here where they'll show Blair Witch at night in the woods. And I love the idea of building on the experience, so it's not just what you're watching on screen, but actually the environment that you're immersed in at the same time that can enhance the experience of being disturbed. So for me, I think that both art house films and the sleazy exploitation films have the power to disturb me. It's interesting to note that they do so in different ways, with the tendency of art house films to build up this kind of sense of dread and mood through the atmosphere, whereas the sleazy exploitation films kind of batter you over the head with relentless violence. On that note, it's interesting to discuss the concept of what specific acts of violence that would make you think twice about watching a film. Are there any specific things that will turn you off from watching a film?
So for me, the one thing that I find very difficult to watch is scenes that involve rape or child abuse in some way. When I wrote down a few days ago on my list of movies that have disturbed me, two that I included were Bad Boy Bubby and A History of Violence. Bad Boy Bubby begins really the first half hour of the movie is very much concerned with an abusive relationship that involves consensual sex. Unexpectedly, it then becomes a comedy over the last hour of the movie. And I actually really liked Bad Boy Bubby, but the first half hour was difficult to watch. The History of Violence is an interesting one because I remember when I saw it, there were a couple of walkouts in the cinema I was at. It wasn't the violence I found nearly as disturbing as the one sex scene in the movie, which really straddles the line between rape and not rape. To me, it looked like a rape scene. Even if it isn't, it's definitely a scene of very aggressive sex. What was perhaps most disturbing is that it occurred between a really loving married couple. So any scenes that include rape or child abuse, I find very, very disturbing. Reversible is a movie that I know I will never see, for example.
Yeah, especially in Irreversible, I remember the rape scene to be very real and there is no cut. The camera doesn't move around. It really feels like you're there watching what happens and not really being able to do anything. To answer the question, I don't think there is anything that really would stop me from watching a film. There are obviously some subjects that makes me think twice about watching it. We were talking about Mother earlier on, and it's not a film that I know I'm going to watch soon. I know I have to be like right kind of mind before watching it. It's not that the other subjects do not move me or anything, of course. It's just that I guess I'm able to bring myself to think that what I'm watching is just a film, just a movie. What's going on is on the screen, at least, is not real, even though it's obviously something that is sadly happening every day, everywhere in the world, and not just rape or child abuse, but murder, torture, and anything that the human mind can think of. So it's not something I enjoy watching either, but I guess it's easier for me to bring myself to think that what I'm watching is not real. I was thinking about it and I realized that films that I find, well, not disturbing, but very scary as horror films are found footage films, which is because I think it's even harder to realize that what you're watching is not real because it's made in a way that makes you think that it's a film that we found on someone's camera, so it's what's going on is real.
So before we get into the topic of acts of violence that I find disturbing to watch, thought I might respond to some of the points brought up by my co-hosts. The films that Adam mentioned, Bad Boy Bubby and A History of Violence, I'm a big fan of both of those films. They're from a couple of my favourite directors, Off to Here and David Cronenberg. Bad Boy Bubby, I agree, is disturbing to start off with, but it does morph into a comedy, and it's sort of about him getting away from that abusive relationship and making a life for himself. Even though some parts of it were hard to watch, I thought it was necessary as part of the journey that the character goes on. The History of Violence, it's a film that I've seen 4 or 5 times. I really like it, and I think that rape scene is very necessary in there as part of the character progression because without spoiling it too much, it's all about the Viggo Mortensen character wrestling with his past and who he was, and that sort of comes out with the way that he is with his wife. So I thought it was very necessary, though I can understand for some people it might be hard to watch. With rape in general, I don't really find that difficult to watch as an act of violence. I find body mutilations much more disturbing, especially anything to do with teeth. I actually had an incident when I was younger where I walked into a pole at camp. I chipped my front tooth, and none of the teachers would believe me. So watching teeth in films is very hard for me, but I will still watch it. I'll just sometimes need to turn away or cover my eyes a little bit. Any sorts of body mutilations, I'm thinking of films even like Hostel, with like eyes being burnt out. It's very hard for me to watch, but I will still watch it. Even though it's disturbing, it's making me feel something, and I'm recognizing that it's making me feel something. And even Slicing Eyes, even Un Chien Andalou, it's not easy to watch, but it's something that I will still watch. But it's something which is a bit more repulsive for me. I don't know if I'd quite call it disturbing, but it is something that's not easy to watch. What's really disturbing for me is I'm thinking about a Japanese anime film called Barefoot Gen, which is about surviving the Hiroshima blast and the nuclear radiation fallout. And that's got some very disturbing images in there, even though it's an animated film. Body parts melting away, a dog clawing at a door, and his hands or his paws turning into bone. It's got some really shocking imagery in there, even though it's an animated film, and that'll probably be my pick for my number one most disturbing film that I've ever seen. I was going to also just react to something that Clem mentioned. He said that he found footage very disturbing because it's hard to tell what's real or not real. Actually, the reverse of that. I find a film more immersive if it's not found footage. I don't like the found footage format a lot. Or the shaky camera work serves to remind me that what I'm watching is a constructed film. If the camera work is less visible, if it's more formal, as we've been come to know over the last 100 years, I find myself easier to get immersed in there rather than something where the camera's shaking a lot and, you can see the record button and everything. It actually draws my attention to the fact that it has been constructed and makes it less disturbing for me.
I just have to jump in to say that I feel completely the same, Saul, when it comes to any movies that involve what you might call dental torture. And I think it points again to the fact that what we find most disturbing is very personal and often based on our own experiences. For Saul, it was having that incident of walking into the pool. For me, it's seeing my father going through what at this point must have been dozens of dental surgeries over the years. So a movie like Marathon Man was excruciating for me. Scene involving the infected tooth in Castaway was also something that I found very difficult to watch.
So as a huge horror fan, there's not really anything that will turn me off from watching a film. I think that Clem put it nicely in the fact that he says you always know in the back of your mind that what you're watching isn't real. So in that way, I can kind of distance myself from it and forget what is happening on screen because I know it's not real and just enjoy it for what it is. There are certain branch of films that I have tried to watch and just I can't persevere with, and this is the films like the Guinea Pig series and August Underground. It's just torture, repulsive imagery, and little else. There's just no kind of satisfaction or joy to be had in watching these kind of films. And for me, that is kind of where I draw the line. One other thing that makes me think twice about watching a film would be animal cruelty. Thankfully, it's something that we don't see that often in films made recently. But if you look back into the past, you've got films like Cannibal Holocaust, where there's a number of animal deaths that you sadly see on screen. And also Waking, where there's a scene in which a large number of kangaroos are killed. It's really upsetting because you can see the kind of pain and suffering that the animals go through. And I find that completely unnecessary in terms of a horror movie. It doesn't really bring anything to the film.
I didn't see the guinea pig films. I was considering watching one of them for this week's podcast. Upon reading about it, it did sound like it was just torture for the sake of it. Though that intrigues me also because one of my favourite films of all time is Videodrome. Of course, in that you have James Wood tapping into that broadcast of a show, which just seems to be torture and nothing else. I'm sort of intrigued to see something that possibly could be broadcast as part of that Videodrome experience, but I guess for me, myself, watching somebody be tortured with no other reason for it doesn't really attract me to a film. In terms of animal cruelty, that's never really been that much of a turn-off for me. I mean, a lot of it depends upon what you're doing to the animal. I mean, what they do to the cat in like Olo, a French-Canadian film, is quite disturbing, I guess. But things like Cannibal Holocaust, I know a lot of people were saying it was disturbing because the violence actually happened to the animals that actually were killed. The way I look at animal violence in films is it doesn't really matter to me whether it was real or whether it was fake, because what I'm watching is the film itself. The film itself is a static object. Film doesn't change based on what you read about it. So a film doesn't become worse to me or better for me just because animals were or not killed in the making of it. So I think the most shocking thing that I've read about in terms of animal cruelty in a film is the children's film, The Adventures of Milo and Otis, which is apparently the first film that I ever watched in cinemas about the adventures of this cat and this dog. And there's a scene there where the cat jumps off a cliff, and apparently they threw 20 or 30 real cats and killed them off the cliff just in order to be able to make that scene. So that sort of makes you go, but it didn't disturb me as such while I was watching the film.
I haven't seen the guinea pig series either, but I've seen another Japanese film which was made in the same way, which is called Grotesque. It was released in 2009, I think, and it features this kind of mad doctor who kidnaps two teenagers, a boy and a girl, and he tortures them. I believe it is to feel sexual excitement again.
I haven't seen Grotesque, but listening to Clem describe it, it sounds quite interesting because it sounds like it's not just a plain torture film. It's a torture film, but also saying something about the protagonist, that he's getting some sort of sexual fulfillment out of it. Just thinking in terms of some what's described as torture porn horror films, like the Hostel series, I actually kind of like those, even though they're difficult to watch, because a lot of it is about torture itself and about what people get out of it and what people can do to each other.
So when you consider films like Hostel and a Serbian film and those that fall under the torture porn bracket, the filmmakers seem to take great pleasure in showing the extreme acts of depravity and violence in order to disturb the audience. And it's interesting to consider whether that which is implied but isn't actually shown, whether that can be as disturbing as that which is shown. So I think I've got a couple of examples here that I'd like to put forward. So first of all is the shower scene in Psycho, because Hitchcock is a master here in that we don't actually see the blade penetrating the body of the victim. It's just through a number of powerful cuts and the audience's imagination that we think that we've seen this violent act in all of its glory. Another example would be in American History X. There's an infamous scene with curb stomping. In this scene, again, there's clever editing. You don't actually see the act happen, but the build up to it and the cuts that the filmmakers use make us imagine that we've seen these acts of violence. The imagination can be a powerful tool, and it makes these two scenes feel really disturbing when we don't actually see the specific acts of violence. So I'm wondering if anyone else feels that way or has any examples of scenes where the violence isn't shown but is just implied.
Hitchcock was definitely one of the people I thought of as someone who always said the anticipation of something happening is much more suspenseful and terrifying than the actual event. I also thought of Val Lewton, famously made an entire movie, Cat People, where we don't really see anything frightening happening. The entire movie is built around what we don't see. I don't have any specific movies I would mention off the top of my mind. I definitely agree that sometimes what we don't see is more disturbing than what we do. American Psycho, which is definitely a movie that a lot of people find disturbing, if you read the book, I found it vastly more disturbing than watching the movie, to the point where there were many points where I simply had to put the book down and stop reading. I would also mention the movie Apt Pupil, which was originally a Stephen King novella called Summer of Corruption. That was another one where I found the source material far more disturbing than the movie itself. So I think those are two examples of what we imagine with our mind is more disturbing than any visualization on the screen.
While we're on the topic of books, I thought I would mention another author that writes horror books, but never really describe or never really shows what the monster look like is Lovecraft. I'm not an expert on his books, but I've read just a few of them. And I find it really interesting that he never really, in some novels, describe what the monsters or the creatures looks like, and it's up to you to make up your own image of what the characters in the books are watching. And maybe that's the reason why Lovecraft hasn't been adapted into films as much as some other authors, such as Edgar Allan Poe, for example, or Stephen King. Even though I know he wrote the first Reanimator, and there were also The Call of Cthulhu, released 15 years ago. But these are really the two films I think of, but I can think of a lot of films coming from books by Edgar Allan Poe or Stephen King, for example.
On this topic, I just want to refer to something which Yoka, one of our producers, mentioned. And what she said is that films where we don't see what's happening, they can be scarier than actually seeing it. Sometimes when you actually see a monster, it looks quite ridiculous. They give out things like The Night of the Demon from Jacques Tourneur, who did Cat People. It's freaky, but it's a bit scary when you don't actually see it. However, it's more disturbing, I think, when you do see something. So something can be scarier because our imaginations will fill in the details. But for it to be disturbing, it really needs to implant that image in there for me. If I don't actually have the image of, say, those people with that shotgun at the start of Martyrs, or if I don't have that sort of image of the dog's flesh melting off in Barefoot Gen, it wouldn't be so disturbing for me. It might be scarier if it was implied, but for it to be disturbing, that image needs to really be ingrained in my brain.
So it's interesting to hear the points about monsters that we see on screen and whether they are as effective as those that we don't see on screen, and how that plays into the imagination of the viewer and leaves it up to you to fill in the gaps and potentially create something more horrifying that the filmmakers could create themselves. One great example of this, I think, is the Blair Witch Project, one of the most infamous found footage films, because throughout that film, you don't see what is terrorizing the protagonist. It's kind of left to your imagination. I saw that as quite a young viewer, and that frightened the hell out of me because my imagination ran wild. I think that can be just as effective, but as Sol mentioned, that is moving away from the angle of a film being disturbing and in a film being more scary. For me to be disturbed, I think it is usually what is shown on screen that disturbs me, if it has the power to disturb the violence and the brutality. And that isn't always limited to horror films. I find that a lot of war films can be equally as disturbing. You see a lot of the carnage and the violence, and in some instances, when the films are based quite closely on historical fact, you know that these events happened, and that can have the effect of sickening you to the core. I'm curious to see what films outside the horror genre people have been disturbed by the most.
Well, it's interesting that you mention war movies. When I originally made my list of disturbing movies, put down, for example, The Deer Hunter and Come and See. And the truth is, I'm not sure that I found them disturbing as much as I found them desperately sad. They were sad to the extent that they ruined the rest of my day. I say ruined. They weren't bad movies. They were excellent movies. And I'm glad that I saw them. But they affected me in terms of I remained sad for the rest of the day and really affected me for several days further. Beyond that, and beyond some of the other movies I mentioned, like Whiplash, I would mention movies by Kubrick and some works by David Lynch. A Clockwork Orange I found very disturbing, and perhaps that was the age that I saw it at. I saw it when I was 14. I think at that point I was very accustomed to a certain type of movie violence, not accustomed to the type of violence I saw in A Clockwork Orange. This gets back to what I said at the beginning of the episode about movies that betray our expectations. A Clockwork Orange is very violent. It's perhaps no violent than other very violent movies, but it is violent in a way that we're not used to. Violence is extreme. It's not played for laughs. it's played in a sort of very sickening way. So I found that disturbing. And I want to mention David Lynch, and I think this is really an example of how surrealism perhaps can be more disturbing than horror, although maybe the two aren't so separate. Lynch's works have always included elements of horror without perhaps being horror themselves. To think of a movie like Mulholland Drive, there is a very famous scene outside the diner that is very scary. I found the entire thing very disturbing because I just didn't know what to do with it. I watched it the first time and I didn't really have a clue what I was watching. I felt in some ways that this transgression of tropes of film expectations, the way in which it subverted my sense of reality, was very disturbing.
There are two films I'm thinking about right now that disturbed me when I watched them that are not horror films, even though the second one could be considered a horror film by some. The first one I was thinking about is Saving Private Ryan. Like Adam, I watched this film when I was quite young, let's say. I think I was about 13 when I saw it. And it was the first half hour at the very beginning of the film when the American arrived at the beach in Normandy. And it was the first time that I really saw such violence in a film. So after about 20-25 minutes, I had to pause the film and stop because it was too much for me back then. I especially remember a scene at the beginning where there is this soldier lying on the beach with his entrails out of his stomach. I remember this scene left a pretty big impact on me. I've seen the film a few times since then, and I'm sure nowadays it wouldn't do anything to me. But back when I watched it, it was really, really disturbing for me. The second film I was thinking about is the movie by Michael Haneke called Caché. I don't know if the English title maybe is hidden. I'm not sure if people would call it a horror film. So I would mostly consider it to be a thriller type of film. But I was really disturbed by the overall atmosphere. Just like Saving Private Ryan, I think I saw it when I was maybe 14, 15. And I think it was the first time when I watched a film with this type of psychological torture almost, because it's not really a home invasion, but it almost is in a way, because you're receiving these strange tapes from someone you do not know who he is, you don't know what he wants, but he's filming your house and then sending you the tape. I think it's very strange and very creepy because no one can really do anything about it because there is no menace or anything, just someone sending you tapes. And for this reason, the fact that we do not know who the person behind it all is, what he wants, and his attitude is very disturbing, is the right word, I think. I believe Caché was another one of these films that I really felt disturbed by.
I think I might start off by reacting to some of the films that have been brought up by my co-hosts so far. Deer Hunter. I don't know if I found that too disturbing myself. But the most disturbing thing about it for me was that wedding scene, which seemed to go on for about an hour. In terms of the Russian roulette stuff, some of that was quite intense. I don't know if I would have called it disturbing. C is an interesting film, I guess, just towards the disturbing end of the spectrum. Clockwork Orange is also a film that I saw at an early age, and I don't think I ever found it that disturbing. There was quite a bit of violence in there, but it wasn't like torture violence. And the way the violence was portrayed, or at least initially, was these friends going out and having a little bit of fun, which I guess should be disturbing. But for me, as a 15 or 16-year-old, when I watched it, I just thought, oh, just some teenagers mucking around and getting up to what they shouldn't be getting up to. So I didn't find it that disturbing. Some of the films that were mentioned, Saving Private Ryan, it's an interesting one because I probably wouldn't have been a lot older than Clem when I sat down and watched it. And that didn't disturb me too much. Wouldn't have probably seen a lot of war films at that point in time. Again, I would have been maybe 15 or 16. I would have seen a lot of horror films, and I guess when you see a lot of blood and guts in horror films, maybe it climatizes you to seeing it in other genres. I don't know. Saving Private Ryan didn't disturb me that much at the time, although I don't think I've watched it since. Cachet is an interesting film. What I really like about it is the way it sort of quite breaks the fourth wall, but sort of blurs it. The whole idea is that it's the filmmaker who's sending the tapes to the character there, so you sort of have that blurring line there, but it is obviously a bit uncomfortable because he doesn't know where the tapes are coming from. But I'd probably go for Funny Games as a more disturbing Michael Haneke film, because I guess with Funny Games you have the antagonist going in and rewinding the stuff and going back and doing it again when our protagonists manage to overcome them. I guess Funny Games is borderline horror, so it wouldn't be valid for this point. In terms of non-horror films that have disturbed me the most, the one that I've mentioned a couple times already is Barefoot Gen. I've only seen it once, and when I saw it, it's got this amazing poster on IMDb with Gen's barefoot. It looks like a bright and bubbly comedy. It can't be any further than that. And I guess the expectations played a lot into what I reacted to Barefoot Gen. It was much more shocking than anything I could have prepared myself for, even though it was animated, just the images there. Children dying, the bones becoming brittle and then breaking away, a dog's paws melting away. It really captured for me the horrors of surviving the Hiroshima blast. One of the things that I said about it at the time, which should make you want to see Barefoot Gen if you haven't already, is that Barefoot Gen makes Grave of the Fireflies look like a breezy walk through a park on a sunny Sunday afternoon. I mean, I'd watch Grave of the Fireflies to smile again after watching Barefoot Gen. That's how disturbing it was for me when I saw it at the time, and I've not been able to pull myself to rewatch it since.
There are two things I would like to add to what you just said, Saul. Regarding Funny Games, I didn't think about that film when I was trying to find disturbing films, but it's true that it's a film that is quite disturbing as well. There is a scene you mentioned towards the end of the film where the main character rewinds the film after his partner is killed. This scene was a very interesting scene for me because it was the moment where the film stopped being disturbing for me. I was really disturbed by everything before. I was at the edge of my seat. I was uncomfortable by what I was seeing. But seeing him rewinding the film like that gave the entire film a totally new dimension, a totally new perspective for me. I was like, well, okay, it's just, I don't know, it's just a film. It's a strange, dark film, but still a film. It was almost like a comic relief type of scene for me, actually, when I watched it. It's not a negative thing because I really like the film, but this scene had a special impact on me because it was really at that point where the film took a new dimension for me. A second thing I would like to say is about Barefoot Gen, or Gen, I don't know. I haven't seen it, but you made me think of another film, a Japanese film from 1989, which is called Black Rain by Shohei Imamura. And there is this scene at the beginning for about 20-25 minutes, from what I remember, that features the city of Hiroshima right after the atomic bomb dropped. So we see the chaos that is going on, and we have these scenes of burned inhabitants, children dying or being burned, and everyone going inside and the city being on fire. I think it was a very, very powerful scene and a very, very powerful beginning.
So there's been some great disturbing films mentioned. Interesting to see that a lot of people are obviously disturbed by war films. I can relate totally to what Saul was saying about Saving Private Ryan. Although the violence is intense towards the start, the time I saw it, I was kind of immune to that because of my passion for the horror genre. You get kind of used to seeing that kind of violence, but you can imagine that viewers who have not seen much horror by that point or are not used to that kind of violence, it's surely capable of disturbing or shocking them. I completely agree that Barefoot Gen is an incredibly disturbing film, and I would like to echo Saul's recommendations of that film. It's incredible to think that this animated piece of work can be as disturbing as a horror film, basically. The depictions of the Hiroshima bomb and the aftermath just paint a picture of pure hell, and it's incredibly terrifying at points. And perhaps because it's an animation, that's why it jars you so much, because you don't usually expect that level of disturbance from a medium of filmmaking that is kind of usually reserved for children's audience. I would recommend that one totally. Also interesting to think that films such as Mulholland Drive and Cachet are mentioned, because I love those kind of films where there's just one or two moments perhaps that disturb the viewer. And I love nothing more than watching a non-horror film, no expectation of what's coming, and then there's just a shocking moment or something that disturbs you. Now, I struggle to find films like these, because when you research films to watch because they're meant to be disturbing, it obviously notifies you that you're going to watch something and you're looking out for something that's going to be disturbing. But perhaps newer films, when you see them in the cinema and you aren't aware of what's going to happen, and something like that hits you, that always takes me by surprise, and I love that feeling. So going back to the films outside horror genre that disturb me the most, I will have to bring up Come and See, which is one of my all-time favourite films. It's a war film from the Soviet Union, and it's just this ugly and horrific depiction of war as seen through the eyes of an innocent young boy who's caught up in the Nazi invasion of Belarus during World War II. It's a completely graphic and visceral film that doesn't shy away from encompassing the brutal atrocities and war crimes that were committed in the darkest days of the war. And I think that warnings of its disturbing nature deserve to be heeded. The director stages his action with a dedication to realism that transports the viewer into the heart of the carnage. Stunningly choreographed long takes add weight to the impact of the relentless onslaught. They also demonstrate the breathtaking direction of a master cinematographer at work. The impeccable sound editing enhances the sense of hopelessness as ricocheting bullets whip through the undergrowth and violent explosions shake the earth, stunning anyone caught in the blast radius and leaving them confused and disoriented as we experience firsthand as the audience the unnatural ringing sensation that engulfs their hearing. At the heart of Come and See, there's a haunting transformation. We see a devastating corruption of innocence, with a swift catharsis from childhood to adulthood unveiling before our very eyes as the young protagonist lives through this horrific period in history. It's one of those monumental films that just kind of hits you like a sledgehammer, how devastating and traumatic it is. And for me, that's the pinnacle of a disturbing film that isn't a horror film per se, but you can totally understand why people might consider classifying it as a horror film. Moving on to the horror genre now, I'd love to hear what horror films you've seen that are the most disturbing, that have had a lasting psychological impact, or have just really shaken you to the core.
This is a hard question for me to answer, because when it comes to horror movies, I'm a real scaredy cat. I find horror movies very difficult to watch, not because they're disturbing, but because I get scared easily. And in some sense, every horror movie is a scary movie for me. But that's not quite the same as disturbing, or at least disturbing can mean a lot more. In that sense, the only horror movie that I can think of that I found disturbing was The Shining, and a lot can be said about The Shining, enough to fill many podcast episodes. I guess maybe one of the most disturbing things I find about it is that no matter how many times I watch it, at this point it must be a half dozen or so, I still find it a difficult experience. It still remains very scary. It's still something that shakes me a little. The other thing that disturbs me about it is the sense in which it conjures a sense of unreality. And I'm not just talking about the fantastical elements in the story, the ghosts and whatnot. I'm talking about the sense that movie charts a descent into madness and involves us in that descent into madness, to the extent where if you're really immersed in the movie, as I have been sometimes, you start really questioning what you're seeing and what you understand about what you're seeing on the screen. If I had to pick one, it would be The Shining.
In terms of horror film that disturbs me, I think I'm gonna mention the first real horror film that I ever watched, because I think that was the one who really had a big impact on me and in a way started the love that nowadays I have for horror films. It is the remake of The Hills Have Eyes, the first one, which was released in 2005, I believe. So I must have watched it when I was about 13 or 14. Looking back at it, it's a good horror film, but it's not that scary or that disturbing. But once again, it was the first horror film that I watched, and it was the first time I was confronted to this type of horror imagery featuring these irradiated monsters. There is this scene towards the middle of the film where the father is hanged on a tree and burned alive. There is also another scene towards the end of the movie where the main character who's going out to seek his baby, which has been kidnapped, is trapped in this bathtub somehow, filled with human parts, legs, arms, and so on. These are all scenes that back then I wasn't used to see at all. And for this reason, I found it quite disturbing for the first time I saw it. But I was also intrigued in a way, and something clicked with me. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but somehow I wanted more for some reason. So I started watching a bit more horror films. I remember seeing the Saw series of films and being quite disturbed by some of them, especially the first one. The third one also was quite disturbing for me. I believe it is the third one where there is a scene where there is a guy who's nailed to the ground in some kind of huge bowl and is being drowned in this rotten pig's fluid that are crushed and reduced to fluid, and they're drowning him with it. I thought that was quite sickening when I first watched it, but at the same time fascinating. And I think that's about the two main horror films that really disturbed me the most. They were the first, because they were the first horror films I saw. It was the first time for me to be seeing this type of films, this type of imagery. And later on, for some reason, I cannot recall other films that disturbed me as much as these films.
I thought The Shining was an interesting film to bring up. I don't know if I'd say I'd find that disturbing, but it's definitely quite creepy. One thing I noticed when I last watched the film is that a lot of the terror is just built up through the music and the camera angles, other than what the characters are saying. There's a part where Jack Nicholson is on Danny's bed and he's talking to him, and it all felt really uncomfortable, and I realized that I wasn't actually paying attention to what was being said. It was just the way the music was going and the way that it was shot that was giving me that feeling. The interesting thing about The Shining is that Doctor Sleep came out last year also, which is obviously the sequel to The Shining. Don't know if I'd call Doctor Sleep a disturbing film, but it is a really interesting film, and it's from a director called Mike Flanagan, who did Oculus, which I'd say is actually bordering towards disturbing, about a mirror that might have demonic powers, and it plays a bit like an X-Files episode with a believer and a non-believer trying to work out whether this mirror really can kill people or not. Interesting film. I know it's slightly off topic. The Hills Have Eyes. I've seen the original. I haven't seen the remake. Saw films. I actually have sat through the first 4 Saw films. I didn't particularly like any of them. That's really when I think of torture porn. I really think of the Saw films. I know that defenders of the Saw series have said that it's all about trying to survive and how much do you really want to live, what are you prepared to do. But I find that very repetitive, and I found it a very hard film to watch. I found the first 4 Saw films very hard to watch. I don't know so much disturbing, but obviously it was very hard because, as I said before about body mutilations, I don't like watching that, so I found that I was looking away a lot during it. It didn't disturb me, it didn't really have those images that were ingrained in my mind, the same way that images in something like Barefoot Gen or something like the Hostel films, those have really been ingrained in my mind. In terms of talking about a horror film that I found disturbing myself, I have mentioned Martyrs a couple of times in the podcast. Martyrs, for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's a Quebec film, and it's about this young woman who agrees to help her friend try and get back at the people who she suspects abused her as a child. And I rewatched it this week because I wanted to see if I would react to it the same way. And it's kind of interesting because the first 45 minutes or so of Martyrs is really disturbing because you see this woman go through with a shotgun and killing these children, killing this husband and wife. The whole time through, you also see her imagining this person isn't there. So for the first 45 minutes, you go, oh, she was crazy. This is so disturbing. she's killing these innocent people who have done nothing to her. And then, without spoiling it too much, the plot does develop from there. And it turns out that, yes, they are actually guilty of doing stuff to her. And the reasons why end up being quite chilling by the end of the film. It was interesting rewatching it because I sort of wanted to go, would I find it as disturbing? And I guess maybe not, in terms of that I really felt for her when she was killing the husband and wife the second time around, because I knew why she was doing that and what pushed her towards that. But it was still hard to watch, and still love to do a few film purism podcast at some stage, because Martyrs is not a film I watched in one go. I don't know if I can imagine watching it all in one go in the cinema when it came out. But I did stop and start the film at quite a few points because a lot of it's really intense, and the whole idea of the film seems to be the limits to which human beings can do terrible things to other human beings in pursuit of a goal. As I said towards the beginning of the podcast, it's very realistic. It's not like the Human Centipede where it's trying to be a bit silly and a bit out there. It's actually trying to be very realistic, which is what makes it so disturbing.
It's great that you bring up Martyrs because that is an incredibly disturbing film and it tells quite a powerful story. And that just makes the disturbing aspects of the film hit home even more for me. There's two films that I think of when it comes to most disturbing horror films that I've seen. One was actually brought up by Clem in a conversation we had earlier in the week. Australian found footage film Lake Mungo. The very concept of the film kind of has a lasting psychological impact on the viewer. I wouldn't want to spoil it, but the main concept of the film is that a girl is dead and trying to find out what has happened to her, and they uncover some mysterious footage. And what is shown in this footage kind of just shakes you to the core when you see it. It's more the fact of thinking that if that ever happened to you, how you would deal with it in that situation. And it's something that kind of plays on your mind. And I personally thought about quite a lot after watching the film. For a film to have that lasting impact, I relish that opportunity because it doesn't come along that often. So when a film haunts me for days, I know that it's one that has made a real big impact on me. The other one that I'd like to mention is Angst, an Austrian horror film. This is an underappreciated landmark in Austrian horror cinema. I mean, perhaps the only Austrian horror landmark. And it follows the events of a deranged serial killer over the course of 2 days as he embarks on a series of violent and unprovoked attacks on the innocent people he encounters. The violence depicted is bloody and savage, like a cruel display of the worst aspects of human nature. And this may be shocking to behold, but its true power lies in the craftsmanship of those involved, because what could have been a lowbrow B-movie transcends into the realm of a horror masterpiece thanks to the director's artistic prowess. The seemingly frenzied yet meticulous camera work and excruciating but hypnotising long takes offer a glimpse into a savage world that is rarely displayed with such appreciation for the cinematic medium. And the intensity of the violence is matched by a nerve-shredding soundtrack that claws its way under your skin and exacerbates the relentless nature of the on-screen carnage. Now, Angst was also a film that heavily influenced Gaspar Noé. He cites it as a great influence on his work, and without Angst, we might not have had I Stand Alone or Irreversible or other films from Noé that explore the disturbing aspects of human nature. So I'm thankful for that in the influence that it's had, but also in the experience of watching Angst alone. It's such a powerful and disturbing film that I can't recommend it enough for anyone who enjoys these kind of films but hasn't yet seen it.
To conclude this list of disturbing films, I would like to also mention two other films that I didn't mention before because I didn't really knew where to put them, if they were horror films or not. The first one is a Japanese film from the 90s, which is called 964 Pinocchio, who was made by Shozen Fukui. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It is a strange steampunk type of film which features this sex robot that becomes dysfunctional because he cannot keep an erection anymore. So he's thrown away in the street, but he's completely lobotomized because he's only been made for the purpose of having sex with a rich woman. So he's thrown in the dark streets. He lives there. He even lives underground in Japan, and he will meet with a girl who's a junky from what I remember. And the entire atmosphere is extremely dark. The way the film is made is very strange. The main character is very tortured. He's always screaming and making these strange noises and acting in strange and disturbed ways. So it was very fascinating to see him act completely insane in real life Japan, because once again he's just some kind of a robot but in a human form that has been completely lobotomized and is obviously not fit for society, is not fit to live even. Watching this film made a pretty big impact on me. And the second film I wanted to mention is a film from 2006 called Slaughtered Vomit Dolls by the filmmaker Lucifer Valentine. I'm not an expert on Lucifer Valentine's filmography. I've only seen this film, but I know that all of his films are more or less the same. It's another strange film filled with drugs and prostitutes and hallucinations, and it also features a lot of puking. A lot. Puking on themselves, on others, on things, on everything. And it's pretty much this for an hour or something. And at the end of your watching, you feel a bit dirty, I would say, by what you've been watching. Since they're short films, I actually wanted to see another one by the same filmmaker, Lucifer Valentine, after watching Slaughtered Vomit Dolls. But after watching it, I decided that I needed a break, so I didn't watch anything afterwards. So yeah, I guess I will watch some other films by him at some point, but it's probably not a filmography I'll be binge watching anytime soon. I think the filmmaker even said in an interview that he actually find it sexually attractive that someone's puking on him. So he clearly have some strange fantasies that he likes to include in his films. So these are two films I would recommend for people if they want to see something a bit different. The first one being 964 Pinocchio, and the second one being Slaughtered Vomit Dolls by Lucifer Valentine.
Well, Clem, that's my viewing for this evening lined up, so thanks for those two recommendations.
Yeah, I'm always glad to help.
Just thought I would say on the topic of sexual gratification, how some of that could be disturbing, that people are attracted to puke and other things. There's obviously been some great films made on subjects like that. I don't know if I'd call them disturbing, things like A Dirty Shame from John Waters, and there's a lot of other films that sort of explore the whole realm of what people find to be sexually attractive. It's interesting, it's a different idea of a reason why you might find something disturbing.
So I must say this has been a really enjoyable episode. It's been great to discuss all these aspects of disturbing films, what we find disturbing, and of course our most disturbing films that we've seen. I think it's clear from today's discussion that disturbing cinema kind of appeals to the natural curiosity of viewers who have an affinity with the horror genre and are open to challenging viewing experiences. I know that I'm always on the lookout for filmmakers who attempt to push the boundaries of extreme cinema in this respect. And I cannot wait to see what taboos will be challenged by future generations of filmmakers. It's also interesting to note that our interpretations of disturbing film come back on a subjective point of view and differ depending on our own personal experiences. What the viewer finds disturbing can differ depending on past experiences or personal experiences that have had an impact on their viewing. So I hope that you've enjoyed listening to today's episode, and we would love it if you would stop by at the iCheck Movies Forum at www.icmforum.com to share stories of your own experiences of disturbing films with us on the forum. And also, I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening, and please join us next week where we will have a very special guest on the podcast.
Hi everyone, it's Chris here. I just want to drop in and reveal the identity of our not-so-secret guest. It is indeed Mighty Sparks, the co-founder of the ICM Forum. Adam will join us as well, meaning both of the co-founders of the ICM Forum will be with us. And guess what? It will be twice in a row. Next week, we will explore the decline of film forums as a way for cinephiles to communicate. And the following week, we will dig into the origin stories of the ICM Forum itself And that will be absolutely shocking, actually. There will be some pretty interesting reveals. So thank you again for listening. Join us again soon. And let's see if the episode in 2 weeks will be a little bit disturbing. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.